see you.
Segregation defined American life for nearly a century, with defenders claiming that separate still meant equal. But a pair of psychologists blew that lie up with a pioneering study of the famous doll test.
Some of the children wept during the testing, and some fled the classroom. Some kids were clearly psychologically agonizing over choosing between a black and a white doll.
I'm Eddie Robinson. Author and journalist Tim Spofford joins us to chat about the untold story of Kenneth and Mamie Clark and his new book, What the Children Told Us. As a white man, why did he want to tell their story?
I learned that I was white with all kinds of prejudices. We don't want to talk about them, but we all have them.
Oh yeah, I feel you. We hear you. I see you. It's ICU. I'm your host, Eddie Robinson. You might not know the names Kenneth and Mamie Clark, but you should. No other couple has been at the center for the struggle of civil rights than these two academics turned activists. Their story reflects the struggle of Black America in the years following World War I to the 1970s, a struggle for equality and recognition, while exclusion and institutional segregation prevailed. Kenneth and Mamie Clark were the first black psychologists to earn PhDs at Columbia University, confronting racist and sexist professors that often sought to undermine their ideas and perspectives rather than uplift and mentor. One particular professor and mentor from Columbia would later famously stand with the opposition as the fight against segregation came to a head at the Supreme Court. But before we get into all of that, let's talk about the famous doll study, which defined the life work of the Clarks, and which helped them develop what was really a very simple thesis.
We found that black children knew that they were different, that they had lower status. They internalized in the development of their own self-image these negative stereotypes of the society, and the majority, 2 out of 3 of the children, rejected the brown dolls as being negative and bad, etc.
In 1940, a young Dr. Kenneth Clark walked into a Harlem Woolworth store and bought 4 baby dolls, 2 brown, 2 white. Kenneth Clark would travel around the country interviewing black children, asking them questions like, which doll is pretty? Which doll is nice? Which doll looks like you?
Which doll is the black doll? And which one is the white doll?
That one.
Which doll is the pretty doll? Which doll is the nice doll? Which doll is the bad doll?
2/3 of the children in his initial studies selected the white doll as good. 60% chose the black doll as bad. Kenneth and Mamie Clark believed the results revealed an inferiority complex among black children, basically psychological damage caused by a segregated society. In this day and age, we might think that's obvious. But in the 1940s and 50s, segregation was legal and very normalized, and very violently enforced. Not that long ago.
And I say segregation now, segregation tomorrow, and segregation forever.
Author and journalist Tim Spofford has taken a deep and very documented dive into the struggles and triumphs of Kenneth and Mamie Clark, and how their work as psychologists helped to break down the wall of segregation. He's the author of a new book, What the Children Told Us, the untold story of the famous doll tests and the black psychologists who changed the world. I see you. As we welcome journalist Tim Spofford to the show. Tim, thanks so much for joining us here on ICU.
I'm really glad to be with you, Eddie.
Before we get to the Clarks, I want to talk a little bit about you. right? I mean, you've actually dedicated a lot of your career to shedding light on the stories of African Americans. You also wrote a book about the killings in the early 1970s at Jackson State and HBCU in Jackson, Mississippi. As a journalist, your work has primarily focused on racial issues in education. As a white man with no skin in the game, if you will, why are these stories important to you?
I think partly because they're so unimportant to most of white America. And I obviously grew up white among white Americans, and I've been hearing the wrong story all my life. And I thought, somebody's got to write some of these untold stories, tell them well in an interesting manner without a lot of academic jargon, and make them come alive.
I mean, it's amazing how their lives touch so many important points of Black life of the 20th century, but it seems like they've transformed and changed the world itself with what they've done as a couple. Why are they not listed in the lexicon of civil rights greats?
Well, one thing is no one has told their story. And another reason is it's really hard to figure out. What is it about them and their work that white America, the people who publish books, the people who make movies and so on, don't find all that interesting? I can't figure it out. It's hard. But why didn't anybody pay attention to the Jackson State killings?
On May 14th, 1970, local police opened fire on a group of students at Jackson State College in Mississippi. In a 28-second barrage of gunfire, police fired hundreds of rounds into the crowd.
It's us. It's us.
Yeah. You're listening to ICU. I'm your host, Eddie Robinson. We've been chatting with Tim Spofford about Kenneth and Mamie Clark, who are the subjects of his new book, What the Children Told Us. As you were doing your research and conducting interviews for this book, Tim, what was the most shocking or the most profound information you learned that you came across? Go.
I think the thing that unsettled me most was in Library of Congress reading the test sheets that Kenneth took for each child. He tested 253 children. And by the way, the reason Mamie didn't do the testing is that she was pregnant at first and then gave birth during the testing. So he had to go out on the road and do it himself. But she was very much integral to the whole thing. Now, these are all black children. Some of them made disparaging remarks about the black dolls. They had 4 to choose from, 2 white, 2 brown. And some of them actually denied they were black, which really shocked me. One boy said, I'm a white child. I've just got a suntan. And there was a girl also these are the ones that really stood out and I wrote about. The boy was from Springfield, Massachusetts, and the girl was from Hot Springs, Arkansas. And she said essentially the same thing. I'm white, and I just found that really hard to grapple with.
You're listening to ICU. I'm Eddie Robinson, and we're chatting with author Tim Spofford. And he's here to talk about the legacy of 2 pioneering black scientists, Kenneth and Mamie Clark. They're the subjects of his latest book entitled What the Children Told Us, the untold story of the famous doll tests and the black psychologists who changed the world. Well, let's grapple with the couple in and of itself, because you really do a fantastic job in detailing their history, their lives growing up, their studies, their courtship, their ups and downs. Mamie was born in Hot Springs, Arkansas. Kenneth was born in Panama, but grew up in Harlem, New York. Mamie was from the South, from basically a well-to-do family. You say black aristocracy even. They were well-to-do. And Kenneth was born in Panama, actually raised in Harlem. He had to adjust to being an immigrant, being black in the United States, of course, and later had to adjust to being the only black person in places like Ivy League colleges like Columbia. He was also growing up during the Harlem Renaissance, which was awesome. But in your own words, Tim, how would you characterize the differences or perhaps even similarities with Kenneth and Mamie, and in essence, how they really were meant to be together.
Well, they were profoundly different. In fact, I think that there probably aren't all that many couples that were so different as they were. Mm-hmm. She's from the South, he's from the North. She was rich, he was poor. She was an introvert, very quiet, and he was an extrovert, very, very talkative, extremely talkative, even combative, aggressive at times. She was not that. She was the epitome of elegance, grace, and diplomacy. She was a real diplomat. But they did have things in common, too. One was social justice, a real reverence for that. Mm-hmm. Another was they loved jazz. Another was they were both Episcopalians. Another one was they both had one parent from the West Indies. Kenneth, his mother was a Jamaican by birth, and Mamie's dad, who was a doctor and hotelier, he was from St. Kitts in the West Indies. So there were these really important things that brought them together, but they were a real solid couple. They didn't do anything. They did virtually nothing apart. All the major projects of their lives, including raising a family, they did together.
Now, this was still in an era of eugenics, a time where racist ideas were at the center of academic thought, of genetic superiority of white, European-descended people. Kenneth is even quoted at one point as saying that whites were blinded by having a psychological sense of superiority to blacks. You know, Mamie and Kenneth met at Howard. Was this what they were being taught at Howard? I mean, here you have a black institution, but still had many white professors that were educated with those ideas, right?
Yes, one of their professors was a white man, as a matter of fact. But the professors that they were in close contact with who were black were very much integrationists. Howard was a kind of almost like a think tank of progressive ideas on the subject of segregation and integration. So they were brought up in the faith of integration. Their professors tended to be even radical integrationists. And Ralph Bunche, for instance, who won a Nobel Peace Prize, was one of them, and he engaged in protests in Washington, D.C., a sit-in at the Capitol in the lunchroom, House lunchroom. They were, and I think Kenneth uses the word indoctrinated in the idea of the importance of joining in the intellectual resistance to racism and segregation.
Mamie and Kenneth were both mentored by Francis Sumner, the first African-American to get a PhD in psychology. He really was an important mentor to them, throughout their careers. A lot of professors at Howard at that time were indeed white and not really helpful to their students, especially towards women, like so many of the experiences that you described Mamie having to deal with. But how important was this mentorship of Sumner in guiding their careers?
It was crucial. He taught them about the ideas of Alfred Adler. Now, he was a Jewish Austrian, I guess you could say, psychoanalyst, and he worked with Freud. And he was kind of like the right-hand man of Sigmund Freud before they had a big falling out. Adler is the figure who brought up the idea of the inferiority complex, which became very, very much a widely known and discussed theory that all of us are brought up as children to feel inferiority to our big brothers and sisters and adults, the people that are bigger, older, and more acculturated than ourselves. And that idea was that this is the spring that makes us aspire to be better, or it makes us worse. That is, some of us resent the superiority of these bigger, older people, and some of us emulate the bigger, older people for the good. But some of us resent it and become bullies, become aggressive, even criminal, This was Adler's gift to the science of psychology. And the Clarks, Sumner conveyed that to the Clarks, and that idea informs all their research and even their lives and the things they believed. It was this concept of the inferiority complex, which is highly controversial, especially among black people. Kenneth, in particular, theorized that whites feel superior to black people and have for centuries, and black people have because of their mistreatment, the abuse of them in America, in widespread denigration of them in popular culture and throughout history. Kenneth theorized that they had a psychological block that they needed to get over. And so the doll test was in part a study of that, of identity, of racial identity, the way black children, even as young as 4 years old, how they perceive themselves and their race and their neighbors.
If you're enjoying the show, subscribe to our podcast. Look for ISEEU, that's the letter U, with Eddie Robinson on your favorite platform. You can also find us on YouTube. Coming up, we continue our chat with author Tim Spofford. We'll take a deep dive into the actual doll test. What did the Clarks learn as they tested children across the country? And what was so troubling that they actually considered holding back their results? Keep in mind, Kenneth and Mamie Clark were the first African Americans to earn PhDs in psychology from the prestigious Columbia University. One of their mentors was a die-hard segregationist. What was it like for them to study under an admitted racist? I'm Eddie Robinson. I See You returns in just a moment. If you're enjoying this program, be sure to subscribe to our podcast, I See You with Eddie Robinson. You can hear all the past episodes and be notified when new episodes are released. Also, please take a minute to give us a review or comment. We love getting feedback from our listeners. You're listening to I See You. I'm Eddie Robinson. We've been speaking with journalist Tim Spofford. He's the author of What the Children Told Us, the untold story of the famous doll test and the black psychologists who changed the world. Before the break, we were talking about Kenneth and Mamie Clark, how their respective childhoods and the ideas that they were exposed to at Howard University would influence their pioneering work to help end segregation in the United States. That work would center around what everyone came to refer to as the doll test. Now, this test was actually built on the work of the Horowitzes, a white liberal couple that had shown drawings of black and white boys to male students ages 2 to 5, some black but mostly white. They asked who the boys wanted to have in their class from those drawings. Most white boys rejected drawings from black boys. Surprisingly, several black students also preferred white boys. The Horowitzes concluded that society's bigotries filtered down to children. But Mamie thought there were several blind spots and weaknesses in their study. Tim, what did Mamie do to build on this for her master's thesis?
Well, she took Ruth Horowitz's study, which was very tiny. I think it was based on only 16 kids.
Interesting.
She felt that any sample that small was worthless. Another thing that she looked at was that there were no girls' pictures. Although girls were taking the test, there were no pictures of girls. So why would a girl identify with a picture of a boy? So she felt that that was another fatal flaw in Ruth Horowitz's research. You know, Mamie rightly wondered if Ruth was correct in thinking that a black child opting for a picture or identifying with the picture of a white child this was wishful thinking that the black child was white. Mamie felt, well, this might be just a white bias. And so Mamie is very, very skeptical. And so she conducted a much bigger study in Washington, D.C. and in New York State. And it was more than 200 children, and these were nursery school children. And she showed them pictures of white children and black children. And she asked them which looked like them. But she came up with rather similar results to the Horowitz's results. And so she was, again, kind of baffled. And the doll test was developed by the Clarks as a more sensitive instrument to try to get a clearer handle on why these black children were opting for pictures of white boys instead of black boys.
And why is that doll pretty?
Because he's white and he has 2 eyes.
Which doll is the ugly doll? Why is that doll ugly?
Because he's black.
Which doll looks most like you?
Like me.
Yeah, which one looks like you?
And that one.
Okay.
That doll.
It almost seemed as if they were hesitant to publish the results because they weren't happy with the idea that black children saw themselves as being bad. You're right? Is that really what gave them pause?
Oh, I think there were a couple things that gave them pause, but I think you're right. Kenneth felt very guilty about this. Some of the children wept during the testing, and some fled the classroom. Some kids were clearly psychologically agonizing over choosing between a black and a white doll. Some of the children seemed to agonize over that. Mamie devised a coloring test because there were additional tests part of the doll test. And one was a coloring test in which you would color boys the color you think boys should be and the color you think girls should be. And some of those children were using white to color the child. This is the color that children should be. And they used white crayons. And some of them used orange, which Kenneth regarded as a kind of equivocating, not wanting to deal with their own race.
Interestingly enough, one of Kenneth and Mamie's mentors at Columbia was actually a blatant segregationist, Dr. Henry Garrett. He actually nominated Kenneth to the prestigious Sigma Chi.
Yes, that's right.
He showed respect to Kenneth, even though Mamie was doing a lot of work for Kenneth. But he didn't give any respect to Mamie as her mentor for her projects, right?
Yeah, I think about Garrett. Garrett was from Virginia, and he was educated in Richmond schools and University of Richmond. And he was a segregationist, which is a nice, polite way of saying he was a racist.
Yeah.
I believe Garrett was at the forefront of a group of psychology professors at Columbia that didn't want Kenneth enrolling there. However, there were some white psychologists who went to bat for Kenneth, and Kenneth was admitted only on a temporary basis. Kenneth came in and basically blew them away. He performed so well on his doctoral entrance exam or qualifying exam that they told him that his performance was the best of all the candidates. So he was then very quickly accepted as a full-time doctoral student. I think what Garrett did was he kind of embarrassed himself by trying to bar Kenneth. This is my theory. I don't have a lot of evidence. And I think he was trying to show his colleagues that he really wasn't just a bigot by nominating Kenneth for this prestigious award, academic award, on the basis of the quality of his dissertation. So I think that explains it. Now with Mamie, he didn't need to get over that. Mamie was just allowed in because, she was brilliant, she was smart, she had all the credentials, and they just let her in the door without any of the nonsense that they put Kenneth through.
Mamie's master's thesis focused on preschoolers, and she found that children as young as 3 years old have a self-identity I don't want to call it a complex, but they have somewhat of a sense of their race. Like, for instance, I have a 2-year-old that I'm raising, and I can definitely confirm that he has his own identity and he has his own personality, so to speak. But he is of mixed race. I had him through surrogacy with a white woman who was French, Polish, Irish, and German. Do you think my 2-year-old child, Tim, would be aware of his race based on what we know from Mamie's master's thesis?
And the doll test also.
And the doll test, yeah.
I think the Clarks would say that their test results for 2-year-olds tended to be random.
Okay.
In other words, they didn't think that children really at 2 had a clear awareness of who they were as distinct human beings, much less a clear idea of race, of their race. But around age 3 and 4, the Clarks wrote, this is when your racial identity begins to flourish, begins to crystallize.
Interesting.
And they also leave us with a suggestion that as children grow older, they're less prone to they're not prone at all to failing. We'll call it failing on the doll test. As children progress and they become more worldly and understand the world better, they would look at the dolls, because they did try it with teenagers later,
right,
and just saw that the doll test simply didn't work. The teenagers would laugh and say, hey, they're both the same doll.
It's I See You. I'm Eddie Robinson with author and journalist Tim Spofford. His latest book, What the Children Told Us, offers up untold history of the life and legacy work of 2 Black psychologists, Kenneth and Mamie Clark. Their research and series of experiments back in the 1940s were designed to test children's racial perceptions and attitudes towards black and white dolls. Little did they know that their study and groundbreaking analysis would forever change the course of the civil rights movement. Tim is calling us from his home in St. Petersburg, Florida. I guess it helps or encourages kids of this young age, like, 2 years old, when their parents present them with experiences that help them understand their race. For instance, every morning, when we are headed to daycare, Tim, what I do is throw on Aretha Franklin, Young, Gifted, and Black. And it's fascinating to think, because the very first quote that you have in your book, it just really resonated with me, Tim, so much. I'm going to read it to you from Melba Beals. It says, "Black folks aren't born expecting segregation, prepared from day one to follow its confining rules. Nobody presents you with a handbook when you're teething and says, here's how you must behave as a second-class citizen." I find that quote to be so fascinating, and it really resonates throughout the entirety of your book and your read. And I find myself constantly wondering what my child could be thinking, especially as it relates to race, especially as it relates to identity, as it relates to how he's interpreting his own complexion. It's just very fascinating to me how perhaps even a mixed child would go through the doll test and the results that you would find there.
Yes, well, that was one of the reasons for Mamie's skepticism about the Horowitz test, the test results. She thought that a number of those children might have been light-skinned who took the test, and therefore did make sense that they were selecting a white doll, because maybe their shade skin tone was closer to white than brown. So that's why that was one of the additional reasons why she was skeptical of Horowitz's results. But what the Clarks did with their test is that they had a little code, 3-letter code, to record the skin tone of each of their test subjects. And there were 253 of them. And so they would look at a child who was doing the coloring test, and they would look at a child who was taking the doll test, and they would see how they were agonizing, and then they would look at their skin color, compare the results, and so that test was a lot more sensitive than the Horowitz testing.
During moments of Black History Month, February, it's fascinating to learn, Tim, about people that may have been well known in their own time, but folks today may not be made aware of these individuals now. In this day and age of groups and organizations, fighting rigorously to ensure many of these individuals aren't known to the public through classrooms. But through reading this book, what would you like, Tim, folks, whether they're black or white, what would you like them to take away from the Clarks?
Well, I would like them to take away, first and foremost, that they created this doll test and that they worked with Thurgood Marshall. Kenneth was Marshall's star witness in the federal courts. The Clarks worked together for years with him to gain that Brown ruling.
Thurgood called me at the college and told me not only that the decision came down, but that Justice Orrin had specifically mentioned the psychological testimony as key in repealing Plessy.
But beyond that, people that I know intimately who've read the book said, geez, I knew about Clarks and the doll test, but I didn't realize all the other things they did. And there were many. For instance, Kenneth was the most prominent black scholar of his era. He was the president of the very distinguished American Psychological Association, the first black person to hold that position. He was on the Board of Regents. His best-selling book, Dark Ghetto, very greatly informed the very famous Kerner Commission report on we called them riots, the race riots of the 60s. That's what we called them. But they were more politely called civil disorders. Kenneth had that presidential commission in his palm. And they end the book, and by the way, the Kerner Commission report was so informative, it became a bestseller. And they ended the book with Kenneth's testimony, describing his testimony. Mamie helped found Head Start. Kenneth helped found, and in fact, he was the founder of HARU, another war on poverty program. He was also the founder of the first black think tank in the United States, called the Metropolitan Applied Research Center. So these people did an awful lot. They were very prominent in their day. They were very well known. They were among the best known black couples in America. We Americans forget our history very quickly.
Coming up, segregation in the United States lasted for nearly a century, from 1865 to the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. At least that's how long legal segregation lasted. But the actual practice of segregation still existed, regardless of actual legislation. So, how did the Clarks confront segregation in their own backyard, New York City, where remnants of segregation have been persistent to this day? I'm Eddie Robinson. Our final segment comes your way right after this. If you're enjoying this program, be sure to subscribe to our podcast, I See You with Eddie Robinson. You can hear all the past episodes and be notified when new episodes are released. Also, please take a minute to give us a review or comment. We love getting feedback from our listeners. This is ICU. I'm Eddie Robinson. We're speaking with Tim Spofford, author of What the Children Told Us, the untold story of the famous doll test and the black psychologists who changed the world. And the Clarks really were superstars in their day. They were friends with so many important and influential black Americans. They vacationed with Martin Luther King and Coretta Scott King. Author Ralph Ellison and artist Charles Alston were frequent guests at their many dinner parties. Of course, future Supreme Court Justice Thurgood Marshall was a collaborator and friend, and they even later befriended Malcolm X. Now, Tim, I like that you detail a lot of the personal life of the Clarks, Kenneth and Mamie Clark, because it shows us that they didn't grind all day long, and yet work was so important to who they were. After the victory of Brown versus Board of Education, they didn't just rest on their laurels, right? They looked close to home at segregation in the New York City school system. Of course, Tim, this was not a southern city with what they called de jure or state-sanctioned segregation, and yet the schools were very much segregated. How did officials react when the Clarks called out desegregation in New York public schools?
I have to give the Ella Baker a lot of credit, too, because she worked with Kenneth and Mamie.
Friends, brothers, and sisters in the struggle for human dignity and freedom.
Ella Baker was, back then, the head of the NAACP in Harlem and even became the head for the statewide NAACP. And she was a key person with Dr. King in the SCLC. And then with the young people in Nashville, in the Nashville movement with John Lewis and so on. So she was a big part of it too. But they put school integration on the news agenda in the news capital of America. And there were stories about it all across the country. It was very important. And it was before Brown. It was 2 months before the Brown decision.
You know, I can't help but think, what kind of results would we experience today? You know, if this doll test could be given right now to children, in your mind, Tim, what results would come of it? You know, based on what you've researched, based on what you've investigated about the Clarks and other psychologists with similar testings, how do you think today's generation of children would perform if given the same doll tests from back in the day?
Well, the interesting thing is that the Clarks had such an impact that the doll test has been repeated over and over and over. It has never stopped. And there are countries all over the world where researchers and even students have conducted doll tests. But this still happens today and also in the United States. Usually the people who do a doll test put some wrinkle in it that's different, a little different, or a lot different from the Clarks. And so that obviously affects the test results. But let me put it this way. Starting in the 1960s, after the beginning of the Black Power movement, the Black Arts movement, you began to see the Black Pride movement. You began to see the doll test results change. And there were more black children that opted for the black doll. And that's interesting. However, that didn't mean the end of the situation of black children denigrating and rejecting the brown dolls. That still happens. But the results are quite different. I think in general that the signs are more hopeful of an acceptance of that brown doll. But still, there are disappointing results depending on, who's the researcher and how it's done.
Point taken. That's true. I was watching this interview on YouTube from Boston's WGBH with Dr. Kenneth Clark on, and it was back in 1988, I believe.
Racism, as I see it, is indicative of lack of self-respect among all the groups. You don't hate other human beings if you have a positive sense of your own being.
And I just thought that was so powerful, what he said. And you can, in my mind, practically lift this 1988 interview to present day. Why do you think we're still dealing with this education piece, Tim, as it relates to racism and how children learn about these things, and perhaps even hierarchy in terms of inferiority and superiority? Why do you think we're still dealing with this some decades, some maybe perhaps centuries later?
Well, I think what Kenneth was trying to say, without bringing a lot of psychology jargon, he was trying to say that a lot of white people feel inferior. And when you're not confident about yourself, you often seek to blame others. You look for other people to blame, to attribute all your problems to. Look at our politics today. State of Florida, where I live right now, our governor is doing everything he can do to ban Black history. Oh, what's that all about? Is he really confident about his racial identity? Is he confident about his own politics? I don't see confidence in that man. I see a lot of restlessness and opportunism, of course, too. And it's always been the case in America that people who are seeking power try to turn possible followers against others that they can blame for their own inadequacies. Today, I'm giving you an unvarnished glimpse at what I believe. Today, we're seeing among the white working class the closing of all the factories that were humming when I was a kid, very few union jobs. White women are doing better in college and high schools than young men are doing. And this leaves men feeling pretty insignificant, pretty insecure. And so what do you start doing? Well, you start blaming women for all your problems. I'm afraid this is one of the most human motions that there is.
I would love for you to share with us your thoughts, your perspectives, perhaps even an incident where you've had to take a step back and examine for yourself notions of privilege. Any experiences that you can share with us that have shaped your thinking, your insight, even today.
One thing was, when I was 3 years old, and my mother told me this story. She's the source of this story. My parents were poor, white, working class. They left Bennington, Vermont, moved to Troy, New York, when I was 3 years old. And they stayed in that home something like 6 months in Troy, which had a Black population of about 4%. And one Black family moved on our block, and my parents immediately, as soon as they could find an apartment, moved to an all-white town across the Hudson River in the middle town of Cohoes, New York. My mother told me that story when I was a teenager, and I was horrified.
Wow.
When I was in elementary school, I had an English teacher, and she spoke to us one day, and this is around 59, and wow, things are really happening on the racial front in that era, after the Brown versus Board of Education decision. And she told our class that she was talking to a Southern white woman about race and asked that woman, what did she think about Black people? And the white Southern woman said, I don't have anything against Black people. I just don't want to associate with them. Then my white English teacher looked at the class and said to her, and I think she spoke well.
Thank you for that, Tim. You're listening to I See You. I'm Eddie Robinson, and we've been chatting with author Tim Spofford. He's here to talk about the legacy of two pioneering Black scientists, Kenneth and Mamie Clark. They're the subjects of his latest book entitled What the Children Told Us, the Untold Story of the Famous Doll Tests and the Black Psychologists Who Changed the World. The Clarks worked against segregation, right? Thurgood Marshall used their work to underpin his arguments to the Supreme Court in Brown versus Board of Education. Integration was still hard, years after that. And we had a high watermark of integration in the late 80s. We are, unfortunately, again, as segregated in schools as we were in the 1960s in terms of, white kids going to school with mostly white kids and Black kids only going to school with Black kids and so forth. What would the Clarks think of this reality now, Tim? What do you think?
Well, they were really anguished by it. They felt terrible. Mamie died in 1983, and around the time before her death, she expressed that to Kenneth. And Kenneth was always talking to reporters all the time, so his ideas were really well recorded, and he was heartbroken. I don't think we should despair. The Brown decision didn't solve all our problems by any means, but it solved a lot of them. Now, one thing is, in rural Southern America, there were virtually no high schools for black children. None. Zero. Some states had one black high school. And a black school in the South, outside of the major cities, before Brown, would typically have outdoor toilets. It would have a bucket of water somewhere, maybe on the front steps of the school or inside, and a dipper, and the children would drink from the dipper. We don't have that anymore. And why don't we have that? We don't have that because of people like Thurgood Marshall and the Clarks.
That's right.
Who won the Brown decision. Because as soon as the South, the white South, began to see that the Supreme Court was coming after them, what they decided to do was build a whole lot of schools for black kids. And they were made of brick, and they weren't perfect by any means, but they were a hell of a lot better than one with outdoor toilets and a dipper for a drink of water from a bucket. So we have to remember that. Now, it's often said that New York City schools are the most segregated in the nation. The fact is that black children walk through the doors of predominantly white schools all the time in New York City, and sometimes and often white children walk through the doors of predominantly black schools. This happens. Well, prior to 1954, that didn't happen. I mean, there was no movement in the dual school systems of the South. No white child was allowed to go to any school that was a black school, and vice versa. A black child was simply not allowed in. But with Brown, the South began to have what they called freedom of choice, in which some black parents could send their child to a white school. Well, those kids they went through hell. They were treated like dirt. And that's not a great improvement, but that was the transition and that those poor children went through and paid a very high price for. But today you will find plenty of Southern schools. I live here in St. Petersburg, Florida, and while you may argue that they are not perfectly integrated, people of all races do go to those schools. So sometimes those of us on the political left tend to despair and wring our hands and just say things are really much worse than they ever were, and there's no chance or possibility of change. But there have been a lot of huge, huge changes in America. This isn't the same country, and Brown versus Board of Education was the beginning of that change. Brown made racial integration of public services, for instance, possible, because about 10 years after the Brown decision, you had the Civil Rights Bill of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Then, for the first time, a lot more black people could vote, and almost overnight, all motels, hotels, lunchrooms, restaurants, all over the nation that were closed to black people suddenly had open to them. Now, that's not to say there were holdouts, because there were. And there are always people like our governor here, Ron DeSantis, who fight against black history. There are always going to be people like that.
We believe in teaching kids facts and how to think, but we don't believe they should have an agenda imposed on them.
And if we, people of conscience, simply wring our hands and say, oh, we can't possibly change this, it's so bad in America, it's just, there's no point in struggling. No, you have to struggle, because you can make change, and the Clarks are proof of that.
Of all of your accomplishments and challenges that you faced in your life, in your career, in teaching and writing and your journalism, all that you've experienced as a man, as a husband, as an author, as a journalist, what lessons have you learned about yourself thus far?
Wow, that's a great question. I learned that I was white with all kinds of prejudices of every kind, and we all do have prejudices. We don't want to talk about them, but we all have them. Doing this work, I'm always saying, geez, when I was 14, 15, look what I did, look what I said. When I was 22, look what I thought. When I was 38, look what I thought. I'm still 38 years old. And, you just keep asking yourself, why is this? Why don't we just sit down and talk with each other? And I was at my first book talk for this book. There was a white man there, and he loved black art. He was a collector of black artists' work. And he turned around and talked to his fellow white people who were at the book talk, and he just said, look, just talk to black people. Sit down with them. Find out what they think. They're really nice. You'll really enjoy it. And I thought that was great advice.
He's author and journalist Tim Spofford, author of the book What the Children Told Us, The Untold Story of the Famous Doll Test and the Black Psychologists Who Changed the World. Tim, thank you so much for your generosity and your time, and for being a guest on ICU.
Thank you, Eddie. I really enjoyed it.
Our incredible team includes Technical Director Todd Holslander, producers Laura Walker and Mincho Jacob. We had help this week from Sky LeBron and WUSF in Tampa Bay, Florida. ICU is a production of Houston Public Media. Visit us at iseeushow.org for more about this week's episode and links to our social media channels. I'm your host and executive producer, Eddie Robinson. Oh yeah, I feel you. We hear you. I see you. Thanks so much for listening. Until next time.